it's Rowan, and today I'm going to be talking about the queer history of the Oscars. So this is very similar to the videos that I normally make in that we're going to be talking about a queer pop culture history type topic, but slightly different because I have a guest today. So the guest is my friend and podcast co-host Jazza. We co-host the Queer Movie Podcast together. It's basically what it sounds like. Every other week we either deep dive into a particular queer genre of cinema and a particular film that's like quintessential within that genre, or we have a guest episode where we talk to some amazing kind of queer people about the movies that made them queer or their queer movie hot takes. It's very fun, and so I thought on this channel, as a little extra video this month, we would just give you a flavour of the way that the podcast runs. So we're going to be discussing this topic together, talking about this history. If you enjoy, then check out the podcast. I will put the links in the description. So we have some notes on our screens as we do for the podcast.
We prepared.
Very different to my YouTube videos where I'm like looking at the camera. This is very nice for me. I can actually look down at my notes, and it looks like it's actually part of what's happening on screen.
And you can like cut to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Cut to you.
Cut to me. Cut to you.
Oh my god, future Rowan's gonna hate
Thanks,
this.
editing Rowan. So first of all, I want to talk about like queerness in Hollywood in general in this period of history from when the Oscars started in the late 20s. So we are very much starting out at a time when, in a lot of countries, including the UK, being gay was illegal. You know, let alone talking about things like equality, like marriage equality, being like anti-discrimination, like all of this stuff wasn't even on the cards at the time. And so I don't think it's any wonder that we don't see a lot of like queerness at the Oscars very explicitly in these beginning years, right? Because it just, it's just not a thing that in society is necessarily celebrated, shall we say.
I know you're being yourself, but it was literally illegal.
Like it wasn't celebrated so much.
Like there weren't so many pride parades.
Oh my
God
god, people
knows
just
why.
like weren't that into it back then. It hadn't become like popular
yeah,
yet.
sure. It wasn't trendy yet.
Yeah, it wasn't really trendy. And so we also had the Hays Code, which I've talked about a lot on the channel. We've talked about in the podcast before, essentially like self-censorship that Hollywood brought in. Basically impossible for you to have explicitly queer themes in a positive way for like a very long time in Hollywood.
It's one of the reasons that we ended up having loads of queer coded characters. A lot of people have theorised, which love that. Would have never had so many of the icons. Would have never had Scar from The Lion King.
Truly, we have. You know what? The Hays hot take from Jazza. The Hays Code was in fact a very positive and affirming piece of queer history.
I love that that's now on the internet as stick that on my Wikipedia
Such
page.
a beautiful legacy.
I know, right? Jesus.
So it's not surprising that for a very, very long time when we're talking about the Oscars, there's really nothing to talk about in terms of open queerness. We will talk a little bit later about potential closeted or like under the surface queerness that's there. But I think it's important to note that at the time, these people were not out. It wasn't like the Oscars or Hollywood rewarding queer actors or queer performers. In fact, it very specifically was rewarding them often for like not being openly queer. So the first Academy Award presentation, as it wasn't really a ceremony. It was held in 1929 and was very, very different to what we think of the Academy Awards as today. So it was a private dinner function at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel with an audience of 270 people, and the ceremony lasted for 15 minutes.
I'll be honest, that just sounds like a lovely evening.
So much better than currently is.
Yeah.
No one had to play the music to get people to like leave. What changed in 2016?
So, Oscars so white, that hashtag, feels like generations ago now, to be completely honest, sitting here in 2022. And yet, it was relatively recent. Oscars So White, for anybody who doesn't know, was a movement in the face of multiple years of there being no shortlisted actors of colour being nominated for any of the camera-facing roles, which obviously comes across as reasonably ridiculous. And so in the face of that, the Academy decided to reveal that of its, at the time, 6,000 members, 93% of them were white, and 76% were men. And I can tell you right now, that is not representative of the demographics of the United States of America where they are based. The median age as well was 63, so not too sprightly. They had a goal to be able to completely change or at least move to more equal and representation within the Academy by the year 2020. That has now passed, obviously, but now they've announced that the Academy is 1/3 female and 19% from underrepresented minorities. Again, we don't have like the actual demographic data of everybody that is in the Academy, which makes it really difficult to hold them accountable, to like ask questions quite deliberately on their part, but this is how they do.
And we will talk a little bit later about specifically intersectionality and how that plays a role, because those are very separate statistics, right? So you've got this many people are men, this many people are women, this many people are white or not white. Just shoving all the people who aren't white into one big old category there.
That's a different video though.
Yeah, what it does mean, in kind of very pointing out the obvious here, is that we don't know how many of those like people who aren't white are also women. And that's not to mention other demographics that a lot of people have been talking about being underrepresented. Queerness obviously is something that we're going to talk about in the video, but also disability is a big one. Nepotism has been a huge, huge topic for the British film industry. I know in recent years, there are a lot of actors who are regarded like as up-and-coming actors who are very, very talented, but you very quickly find out that it is not uncommon for all of them to essentially have gone to the very same private schools, have relatives that were already in the industry, etc., etc. And so the Academy you can try and fix the Academy, but it also kind of feels like it has to be fixing the film industry as a whole at the same time, rather than just kind of trying to say, hey, look, the Academy voters are all very representative of the population of the country. I guess we're done. So, okay, we've essentially established that this group of voters who vote for the Oscars are not necessarily very representative. And yet, it is undeniable that the impact that the Oscars have is huge. So this is in many different ways. So the first one being public awareness and public perceptions. So to be an Oscar winner, an Oscar nominee, there's a reason why when people are promoting their films, they'll talk about like Oscar nominee so-and-so, Oscar winner so-and-so, from the Oscar winning director of, because it's still seen in the public eye, it's very important. If you're going to be just like deciding where to spend your money, especially as people kind of feel like they're being priced out of cinemas, things like that, you are going to be really careful. And one of the things that might make you say, oh, that's meant to be good, right, is knowing that it's someone who has kind of been involved in the Oscars some way, has been awarded before. The second thing is money. So films that win at the Oscars see a boost to their sales. Historically, this has been sometimes an enormous boost to their sales. There are movies that get like a huge amount of the percentage of their profits, of their box office income after the nomination. And these are sometimes films which were released a long time before the nominations got announced, and they then put them back into theatres in order to get that extra revenue. That's kind of been seen as something that's very important. In more recent years, it has been reported that this is definitely becoming less of a draw. With this idea of streaming services, a lot of people seem to be seeing nominations as like, oh, this is something that I will remember to stream soon, because oftentimes it's going to be on Sky Box Office or it's going to be on Netflix or Prime like very soon afterwards anyway. So it's not necessarily having the huge impact that it did before, but it still has a lot of cultural capital, and it can still, I think, tell us a lot about the attitude of the film industry, what they want to award, what they think is worthy of being discussed. The average box office revenue of movies that won at the Oscars was more than 3 times the average revenue of all other movies, and more than double the average revenue of nominated movies that didn't win. And I think with that, with it reflecting the entirety of the film industry, reflecting the people at the top at least, their attitude, who are often the people who have the power to commission stuff, to be deciding whose stories get told, we then start to talk about queerness, because I think that looking at who is nominated, what wins, what is celebrated at the Oscars can really tell us about what is getting these budgets put into it, what is seen as important, whose stories are seen important, and what way they want it to be told. So, okay, 2016, they made some changes. 2020, also some changes.
Yeah, so 2020, the Academy decided to bring in some restrictions, regulations, guidelines for films and like crews of movies and actors to actually be able to be nominated, for example, the Best Picture award, which brought it in line with some other institutions like BAFTA at the time, who had diversity quotas in order for there to be better representation on screen and behind the camera as well. It's really complicated, I'll be completely honest.
Excellent.
Like, there's like loads of different categories that if you don't have this type of representation, then you can qualify for this type of representation and this type of representation.
It's very difficult, I feel like, for a film to not technically be able to qualify. Like, it would be really, really bleak to have a film that had none of these things, because it includes things behind and in front of the camera, right? So it's not like you could do something very particular behind the scenes and it would technically qualify regardless of what the story was about.
Yeah, so it does stuff like it can apply to the on-screen talent, whether the main actor, how many of the main actors are from underrepresented groups, and it can do with like X% of the crew can be identified as LGBTQ+, women, people of colour, etc., etc., etc.
For a long time with the Oscars, we didn't really have a lot of queer representation, at least not openly. We do have closeted actors. Just by the nature of, as we discussed earlier, the being a legal thing, probably, people weren't that open about their sexuality at the time, understandably. And a lot of these people, essentially up until their deaths, if they were queer, did not feel comfortable enough to be able to out themselves, to talk about themselves.
Or were contractually obliged to not say that they were publicly.
Very true. There were like morality clauses that meant that they couldn't. So some of the old Hollywood people who were rumoured or like confirmed after the fact by like friends and family and biographies, things like that, would be Rock Hudson, obviously, James Dean, Marlon Brando, Marilyn Monroe, Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, Anthony Perkins, to name just a few. There are obviously more. But this wasn't a case of Hollywood rewarding people because of, or even in spite of, their queerness. This is something that's happened very much after the fact. The public didn't know about this stuff at the time. And so it's useful for us to like look at this as queer history in the way that queer history is very difficult to pin down and nebulous, and look at it with a nuance and with kind of like a sprinkling of caveats, I guess, to calling this queer history.
I think it is quite useful for us as, dare I call us, queer film historians.
Yes, you dare.
Yeah.
You do dare.
I just did. Where you can kind of use the Academy Awards and their nominations and their winners as a way of being able to reflect the society that they are telling the stories of, and the state of like the film industry at the time as well.
I think it's also really interesting because whenever I think about the identities within the LGBT spectrum that haven't really had a lot of airtime, trans people in general are kind of on that list, but also things like asexuality, aromanticism, non-binary identities, things like that. I think that we can see a kind of condensed version of the longer comparative history of like gay representation, where we don't necessarily get authentic, genuine representation for a while, because we have to go through this process of like outsiders telling the story, getting it wrong, relying on stereotypes, like all the way through. Like then we go through a kind of didactic period of like, look at this suffering, how awful it is, maybe you should learn from this, until you get to stuff that feels like it's authentic. And I feel like I kind of just want to skip to that part for these identities. I'm like, can we not just do the authentic thing now? Do we have to have like the weird outsider perspective on this stuff first? So I'm hoping that if that does happen, it kind of gets shortened. So it's just like, we just have a year where everything happens at once and then it's just done. And we just get on with authenticity. And so at this point, I think it's interesting, like we get past the idea of not having any representation into a time when we have the stories being told, but we are essentially getting cis and straight actors portraying those roles. So in terms of best pictures, because I think that's kind of a useful way of looking at it, that have kind of LGBT characters and themes. For the gay and bi characters, we have like Milk, The Kids Are All Right, Imitation Game, and Power of the Dog. Benedict Cumberbatch coming back again for another gay role. And then with the trans characters like Dallas Buyers Club, Dog Day Afternoon, The Crying Game, all examples with cis people playing all trans women actually. And so that's kind of interesting to me that we have this topic that's very, very discussed, right? Of like, is this something which is okay? Like, should this be encouraged? Should queer characters be played by queer actors, etc., etc.?
Yeah, interesting. When we were digging through the tables and tables of Wikipedia articles of queer people in the Oscars, it looks like the only out, and it's complicated when you're talking about like out. Do you mean publicly out? Do you mean that they were living openly, like
in their private lives?
In their private life, like it is somewhat. It's almost like it's a really terrible concept
and quite a nuanced subject and very personal.
Right. Yeah, right. But it looks like the only person who was out and playing a queer character who was from that same identity was Angelina Jolie in 1999 for Girl Interrupted, who identifies as bi and plays a bi character. Which I was not expecting for Angelina Jolie in any way, shape, or form. I feel
she's a pioneer, Jazza. Put some respect on her name.
I mean, I will now. I apologise for undermining her inadvertently.
We'll talk a little bit about this later, because obviously by saying these are cis heterosexual people playing these roles, we are making an assumption, right? That these people are not closeted, that they won't come out later in life, that this is identity. But I think it's important that as far as the Academy is concerned, these are cis and straight people. Like outwardly, as far as anyone knows, and when they're voting, they are voting for someone that is largely perceived, known, or has explicitly said are straight and cis. But a lot of people feel like coming out would damage their careers, for example. So there are reasons why people wouldn't come out.
There's
besides
a
even the
stereotype
normal
of people
ones.
being worried that it would then define you as, for example, in the actor sphere, it would define you as an actor. And,
yes, you are the gay actor playing gay roles.
Yeah, right. Like there are examples, or stories of some of the actors who were approached to play the roles in Brokeback Mountain, for example, where some actors decided to turn down the role, allegedly decided to turn down the role, because they'd already played a gay role and they don't want to then play too many gay roles. Benedict Cumberbatch throwing that completely out the window.
Oh, Benny doesn't give a shit.
Oh, Benny. I bet he hates being called Benny. I just want to put that out there. Poor guy.
I think with trans characters, this feels a lot more cut and dry. This is something that trans people in the people in the trans community have talked about, the idea that it's not just a case of like, oh, actors can play whatever role they're acting, whatever. It's because it has material effects on the way that people perceive trans people. Because a lot of the stereotypes around trans people, particularly trans women, are that they are just secretly a man in a dress. They're a man pretending. And so to put a man in a dress and be like, oh, look, a trans character is quite literally...
how well did they play the role?
Yeah, like it's quite literally replicating stuff that is like tangibly dangerous in reality for trans people. So that's obviously with characters. One of the things that I found really funny about Wikipedia when you search for this stuff, because Wikipedia, we know it's not necessarily the font of all knowledge, but it's very useful for like databases of stuff. It collects a lot of information.
It's got some great tables.
Love a good table. And one of my favourite tables in the whole thing was films with queer themes. Just like, what films that got nominated for Oscars have the vibe? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't think it had all of them, because I know...
Which of these films are...
a little bit like this. Well, because I know that there's definitely some that weren't on the table, I've realised, because Can You Ever Forgive Me is a very queer film. That wasn't on the table.
Oh, interesting.
I've just clocked that. And when looking at like these movies that have the like LGBTQ plus themes that won for Best Picture, around 3 we could find. Not a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. Even not counting all of those years that there were none. Doesn't really feel like there's necessarily a lot. And when you then also look at the fact that a lot of them are things like Dog Day Afternoon, for example, where the focus isn't really on the trans person. You have all these caveats of like, okay, well, this isn't quite like, this is like Silence of the Lambs kind of shouldn't be on the list. Like this one is not really a focus. That one, there's not a whole ton that have been celebrated where it's like, this is a specific focus. Like this is a lead character. This is a historic event.
This is kind of what I see reflected in this. Obviously it's Wikipedia, so big asterisks alongside there. But there is this real stretch to include Silence of the Lambs has queer themes, for example, because there are so few films that have that explicit queerness at its centre, or at least ones that end up getting recognised by the Academy. It's one of the reasons that we started doing this podcast, to be able to kind of like actually celebrate those movies.
I saw Love, Simon in the cinema with Jazza, and Jazza had to like physically bury himself in his coat because he was sobbing so hard that...
Dude, why are you going to help me?
And he considered, and he continued to sob after the sad scenes had finished, and they were back to just the movie again, and Jazza was still crying so hard, which I feel like is the real... possibly the most divisive a movie has been in terms of both of our reactions to it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Within that. But that movie for me was a real impetus for doing the podcast, in that I felt like the reaction to it, especially from a lot of young people, was like, this is the only movie that is for us. And I knew that there were like over 50 other movies, wrote a whole article about it, which had queer teens. And more diversity, more different kinds of storyline. Like there was so much else to explore, and it felt like a lot of people couldn't necessarily find it. And especially not like dug into, discussed in the way that we like to do with, you know, humor and also depth. But one of the things that you also recognize, I think, when you start to look at these movies is that a lot of them have the same thing in common, which is they are sad, Jazza. They're real sad.
That's why I cry a lot.
All of the movies I watch are just miserable.
Yeah.
And so I think there are a few reasons for that, right? So one of them is it's reflecting real life for queer people. Like, this is shining a light on their struggles. Like, this stuff happened. I think it's interesting that a lot of these movies are... That's one, the part of queer life that you decide to focus on. Two, that a lot of them are set historically, right? So they're not set the time period they're in, reflecting life right now. It's looking back and being like, look at how sad the gays were back here. Which one often makes it sadder because luckily queer rights generally have been progressing forward. So if you're going to look back in time, it will be to something that's probably kind of more sad generally. But also I think it distances a modern audience from that. So even people who are kind of like passively homophobic
sure can say, oh my God, I can't believe I've never beaten somebody up, so it should be fine.
I've never shot the first elected gay politician in California, so I'm fine.
Yeah, but that's kind of like the thing, right, from not only those who are watching the movies are, surprise, surprise, majority straight people, because we're always going to be a minority, but also it's those who are in power in the industry making the decisions about the sphere through which you watch, the sphere through which the audience ends up understanding that story. And these, predominantly, the movies with queer themes have... are made for a straight gaze, are made for that audience.
Gaze is in G-A-Z-E.
Why Z-E?
Okay. I was like, the straight gaze is in the gays who are straight?
The straight gaze, G-A-Y-Z-E, you can have that on merch. You can have that for free. You're welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. Don't give the ideas away. We need a queer movie podcast merch coming very soon. And then you have like set historically is sad. Kiss of the Spider Woman, which I really love that musical, but again, it's not exactly the happiest thing in the world, just like set in a prison. Dallas Buyers Club as well. The Crying Game, of course. Brokeback Mountain, again. That we've recorded an episode for, but I don't know if it'll be out by the time this goes out. But
probably isn't, but you are going to
have to... Look out for that, guys.
Yeah, subscribe to the podcast feed in order to listen to it.
Brokeback Mountain hot takes. But yeah, very sad stuff, very emotional. Not bad movies in and of themselves. Like, we don't necessarily want every queer movie to be happy times, let's go. Joyful,
I'm not
Lord,
happy
we
all
adore
of the time.
thee.
I'm not happy all of the time, but I am sometimes happy, and I would like that to be reflected in the stories that are told about like our people, you know,
and celebrated about them as well, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that it's that, like, the thing about the Oscars particularly that's different to just talking about the film industry and like the you know, listing all the films that come out that year is like what is celebrated, what is seen as worthy, and that's really important. Another kind of twist to that idea of like, why are some of these movies so sad or disappointing, other than like reality, is the evil queer also comes out a little bit in here. So Silence of the Lambs, we obviously talked about. Black Swan as well, I'd say, on this, which is on the list, is like the queerness in that doesn't feel like it's like just happens to be part of our character. It very specifically feels like it is part of the obsessive, strange, perverted, villainous element of this.
It plays
like,
a lot on the do I want to be with you or do I want to be you? Kind of like,
but not in a fun way. And I'm growing feathers and I'm like I need to get this role kind of obsessive way.
Getting flashbacks to feathers being plucked out of the shower. Not
gross. There are some like Milk, for example, which I think have like a straddle that line, right, where you've got a very uplifting, joyous, incredible like story of hope in the words of Harvey Milk. Gotta give him hope. But ultimately ends with like, he was assassinated. Yeah. And it is like very emotional, and but it is one of those things that's like, I kind of have to give it credit for the fact that it brings in this story of someone who was extremely important in queer history, but who wasn't necessarily known outside of the people who like lived in the Castro, lived in San Francisco. And it's not just like the general public who don't necessarily have this information about like queer history of film, queer history of the Oscars itself.
It's not just cis-het people who are ignorant.
Sometimes it's the people who are getting awarded the Oscars themselves.
I really wanted Rowan to allow me to tell this story because I just love the messy queer energy of it all. It's wonderful. So Sam Smith won an Oscar for the Writings on the Wall, which is the song for which James Bond movie, Rowan?
Spectre.
Yes. I think so. Is
the
it
only
Spectre?
reason, no, I don't know. Were you quizzing me? Basically,
no, I don't actually know.
The only reason why I said that was because you said Spectre earlier on when we were talking about Ben Whishaw, and it's the only film I could remember.
It is Spectre.
Okay, look at us. We accidentally knew what we were talking about.
Talk about messy queer energy. So Sam Smith goes up on stage and they say, I don't know if this is true. Stop there. Like if you're on a stage where the whole of the world is listening to you and you're not sure about what the truth of what you're about to say, maybe don't say it.
Don't say it.
But Sam Smith says, I don't know if this is true. I heard Ciarán McKellen, Icon, say that no out gay man, which is how Sam Smith identified at the time, has won an Oscar before. And so I just want to, even if it's not true, I want to say thank you to the LGBT community. You're the reason I'm here, blah, 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 blah. There have been many people, many out gay men who have won Oscars in the past. To be fair, mainly for behind the, all for behind the camera positions. Not only just for behind the camera stuff, but specifically for the category that Sam Smith won for, including the incredibly famous Elton John, which... It was just a really fun absolute mess. They were corrected in the press pit afterwards, and something that I really, really enjoyed was Dustin Lance Black, famed screenwriter of Milk that we've talked about, telling the story of Harvey Milk, and
famous spouse
of Tom Daley, the diver. Then went on. Obviously was an out gay man and won an Oscar several years before Sam Smith did, and tweeted, didn't even subtweet, actively tweeted and atted Sam Smith and said, clearly you don't know about me. Hi, I'm a gay man who won an Oscar before you. Also, stop texting my husband. I was just like, I was just here for the messy energy. Then Sam Smith, they actually did do pretty well in being like, well, like, maybe we just need more education about kind of like our stories and stuff, which is true and what we should take away from this, but we should also
take away that Sam Smith said that at the Oscars.
Yeah, and relish the mess that it was. It was quite beautiful. I really enjoyed it. Going back to the idea that the Academy Awards are reflective of kind of like the world that we live in, both kind of like the industry, but also like the wider politics. I think it's really interesting how the nomination of Brokeback Mountain specifically, it's a nominated movie that is a explicit man-on-man romance. And it was the same year, that came out the same year of the first state to legalise same-sex marriage in the US, which was Massachusetts in 2004. And then we kind of... that movie is credited because after it got the nomination, it was tipped to win the Oscar. It obviously didn't. We ended up having a lot more people being exposed to kind of like a same-sex romance. And many people have pontificated about the possibility of Brokeback Mountain being kind of like that gate that nudged open kind of like acceptance in the wider US population, who maybe would have... not been as exposed to LGBT storylines, specifically in this case, gay male storylines. And I think it really reflects an important part of, like, again, the power of the Oscars, of how it decides what stories are really important, who should watch them, and how people are represented, and then the real world consequences that bleed into that. So you can kind of like have Brokeback Mountain as kind of like this big watershed moment of people starting to become more comfortable, maybe, with same-sex couples, and the idea of them having the right to get married. You can say similar things around kind of like the position that Moonlight had in 2016, which was around when Oscars So White and like the Black Lives Matter movement was kind of like starting to build its momentum as a queer black story, and one of the kind of like, the first queer black story to win an Oscar. Yes, that's my point. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Yeah, I think we had this idea of like stories that go into people's lives, their living rooms, having an effect. So I think it's one of the reasons why soap operas are so often the first kind of places of representation for a lot of identities. Cynically, because you can just kill off characters or make them leave and you still have a show. It's not like about leads. And so I think that there are like various kind of in the living room, in the family home, things that happen before that. So you've got things like Will and Grace, you've got like the Ellen Show, things like that, but they are often kind of comedies. And they're also, I think with things like Will and Grace, like they didn't really talk about gay marriage. Like, they didn't really talk about political stuff on that show at all. And so you can see how it can be a very comfortable, like, oh yeah, these gays are fine as it. Kind of like the people who would talk about gay marriage and be like, well, they don't need to be married, right? Like, they're fine. Like, I'm okay with them. I'm okay with gay people. They just can't get married, right? Obviously. But I'm okay with them. And like, it feels like that's not incompatible with watching Will and Grace. And then it feels like there's more complex queer stories, like Queer as Folk, would just have totally put off a lot of audiences. Whereas this one that included sex, that included love, that included tragedy, that included all of this kind of complicated inner workings of these two characters, was like then kind of thrust into the spotlight, thrust into the idea of like, you should see this movie. Everyone is seeing this movie.
Yeah.
And also it was like, we talk about this a bit in the podcast episode about Brokeback Mountain, but that was the advertising that they used. They released it initially in a very small area, essentially just to get the ability to qualify for the Oscars. But it ended up being hugely popular in areas of the US that they really didn't think it would, because of it being more like red states, more conservative states. And actually the reviews and the opinions coming out of those screenings were what gave it this kind of tagline of like, you know, it's the movie that's like resonating with the heartland of America, like all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I definitely think it's really interesting that we kind of have this reflected in what gets celebrated at the Oscars in terms of like when it's like a moment for a particular group. And it's just whether that momentum carries on and those stories carry on beyond those like very topical years of like, oh, Black Lives Do Matter now. Like, here they are.
Ouch.
But we do still have some way to go, right? Like, we have these...
No, I think it's fine now,
watershed moments. All right, in which case, turn the cameras off, we're done. We have these watershed moments and we have these like individual successes, but there are still some that haven't been... Still some like barriers that haven't been smashed through yet. So as far as we could find, there has still not been a best actor or actress who is identified as part of the LGBTQ plus community publicly at the time of winning the Oscar. Ian McKellen was the first openly gay actor nominated for an Academy Award for Gods and Monsters in 1999, which was for a queer role. He didn't win. And he remains the only one who identifies as gay.
Oh, okay.
Who's been nominated. They've had two like queer or bisexual identifying people in Angelina Jolie, as you pointed out, and Lady Gaga as well.
Queen.
And then also some people who came out after their nominations. So Elliot Page being one of them, Queen Latifah being another, which I think we see as these really big, exciting achievements by queer professionals. But again, at the time, if they weren't out, if they weren't known, it wasn't that the Academy was choosing to reward these queer individuals. They just had, like, afterwards, it happens to be like, we can then put that into the history of like the queer Oscars, but it wasn't necessarily part of the decision at the time.
There's this thing of, well, surely if you're a queer person, you want to be nominated in spite of, like, you don't want your sexuality or your gender identity to go into the decision.
Is that your impression of a straight man?
Yes. Fuck you for reading me. But it's the fact that there aren't any queer people who have won the best actor or actress category implies that it holds you back from being able to win that, not that it buoys you up. I think very often having kind of like a non-cis het, non-white identity is seen as something to kind of like buoy you up and seen as like an advantage in XYZ thing. Well, look at one of the largest kind of like awards in the world in terms of its exposure, and we still have those barriers that haven't yet been smashed through. And you can see how it's clearly held back certain individuals from being able to get to those dizzying heights. And also, that's not even considering like if you can't see it, you can't be it argument, which I think has limitations in itself, but it does make it really difficult. And probably does mean that some people are don't necessarily see themselves as getting to the dizzying heights of winning a Best Actor Oscar because they've never seen anybody like them before.
Yeah. And I think when talking about, I know that we mentioned the trans actors playing trans roles in before, we very rarely see trans actresses and actors being able to play cis roles, and that majorly limits them in terms of what roles they can accept because there are only so many trans roles that are being written. And so recently I know that Laverne Cox was in the Inventing Anna What's it called? Yes. Playing a cis woman, like a woman who in real life is cisgender, and she's just in it. It's not commented on. It's not a trans storyline. It's just there.
A woman playing a woman.
Madness. And so I think that the more that we start to see that, the more those opportunities will come up. You kind of hope that will be something that will be celebrated. But like, we know that there are these huge limitations that have been placed, and Hollywood is slow to change. And these movies are getting greenlit and cast like years before they come out. And so even if this stuff is starting to happen now, we're not going to see it for another few years. And then there will be some studios who will decide it isn't worth the risk until I can see if it's financially viable to happen.
Sure.
And those studios are then not going to be putting stuff into production until they see the results in a few years of the ones that are currently in production. And it's all just kind of going to spiral in this way and be a real sticking point, really, for the whole thing. So there was actually an article in Vanity Fair around this year. I think that the fact that Power of the Dog has been is essentially everyone thinks it's a shoe-in to win Best Picture this year. So I think that these conversations around the queerness in the Oscars are definitely like bubbling up again. So Vanity Fair had an article earlier this year that said, compared to the number of outwardly LGBTQ plus characters who've earned their portrayers Oscar nominations since 2002, which stands at a staggering 36 at least, that's an average of nearly 2 per year, and none of them were played by openly LGBTQ plus actors. So it's not even that...
Wow.
Yeah, it's not even that there aren't... It's not necessarily being portrayed. There's a lot of these side characters that are coming in. So like the Dallas Buyers Club, for example, is one of the most like well-known ones.
Where Jared Leto plays a caricature. I won't. I'm not opening that box.
So it's these kind of like smaller supporting role things, but it is supporting these stories, but not necessarily the material experiences of the actors who are part of those communities. And it's again, this is something that's been discussed at length because it's really tricky, because it's one of the only identities that, because you cannot tell by looking at someone, it's very different from us talking about like a blackfishing and blackface, for example, in these roles, or, you know, changing a role's ethnicity. It's a very different kind of conversation. And even talking about disability, for example. And so I think that's the reason why a lot of people are very torn on it, because for a lot of people, it feels like it's just it should just be something that, you know, an actor's an actor. You don't have to be a murderer to play a murderer, which is always an interesting place to jump to when making a comparison, and everyone seems to do it. So the idea of like, you know, that's a thing that we shouldn't be concerned about. But I do think that when you have a situation where not just trans actors not being allowed to play cis roles, but there are gay actors who come out and queer actors who come out publicly and then find their roles restricted in terms of their believability in playing straight and playing leading men, it does have an effect on them. And if you're then not going to give them the roles of their community, what roles are left for them?
It speaks to the default of being straight and cis in this particular sphere of being straight and cis as kind of like being the default, that you then from that position are able to stretch into other roles. You can play someone trans, you can play someone working class, you can play somebody queer, because you're able to kind of like from that center of like what is considered the default, then able to kind of like alter yourself in that way. It's
been interesting to hear. I know that Russell T Davies has done some interviews recently where he's basically been like, I do understand the fact that a lot of my career was off the back of straight people playing gay people, specifically queer as folk is what he was talking about. But he's more recently been like, I actually would really encourage filmmakers to actively within the casting process encourage queer people to come forward for the queer roles, to like make it known that that is something that you are pursuing, interested in. And I've seen a lot of friends who are in the film industry like essentially actively not saying like you have to be out yourself as so and so to play this role, for example, because it would potentially involve people having to out themselves if you were only allowed to apply, but just being like heavily encouraged. But I do think that like almost part of the being rewarded as a cis and straight person for playing these roles is how different you had to become. The challenge, or they're always asked about like how challenging was it to kiss a man, like how difficult was it for you, so tough to go into the mind of one of these homosexuals, like that in
just
itself
saying,
is such
it
an
wouldn't
important...
it wouldn't have been tough for me to kiss a man, and therefore I would have probably done it better.
You would have been a real good, it would have been so good for you.
I know. I'm so alone.
So one of the things that we've kind of touched on when talking about Moonlight, but I think is really important to note, is the intersectionality, for lack of a better term. It's kind of become a bit of a catch-all buzzword, but essentially looking at the fact that we could probably have a similar conversation about Black stories, disabled stories, like these different marginalized identities within the Academy, and who they choose to reward, and like who is getting to tell those stories, who is scripting and directing them, you know, all of these kind of conversations. And so it then kind of is like issue on top of issue when you start to look for, oh, so where are the Black trans stories? Where are the stories about disabled queer people? Where are, like, because I think that there is, Hollywood and the Oscars admittedly sometimes does like problem or like issue driven narratives, but often those issues are very like much for the non-marginalized audience, and so they have to be very simple in a lot of ways. And so it's the reason why we get a lot of like big famous like award-winning movies with a hugely Black cast being slavery movies, where it's like slavery bad, like, oh no,
can confirm.
Oh, and so it's very similar to what we were saying about the idea of like, oh, if we set these queer movies in a historical time, straight people can watch and be like, well, I'm not that bad, I'm not like, you know, attacking anyone, I'm not assassinating anyone. And similarly, white people can look back and be like, well, if I'm not owning human beings, how can I be a racist?
We love a low bar.
Yeah. And so it kind of like, in a very surface level, is like, well, this is what you want, right? We're telling your history. We're giving you jobs as actors. Like, oh, isn't this great? And then we kind of have this situation where it has been pointed out by Oscars So White that a lot of when Black women are like given, let's say, like awards nominations for roles, it's often as like the maid, the slave, the like all of these very specific roles that don't show the range of their experiences and their talents. And so like Moonlight very much was like a out of nowhere kind of movie in terms of the Academy, because it was like, wow, you can have more than one marginalization, more than one issue, more than one thing going on.
And it was a modern story as well.
It was a modern story. It had the writer was writing from his own experiences. It kind of still remains like the only thing of its kind that's gone through the Academy in this way. Okay, so at this point, we've recapped the history. We've had a look at a couple of firsts. We've looked at kind of the reasoning behind why these things are necessarily as moving as quickly as we might want them to. I think especially like one thing we didn't really talk about was the fact that movies have big ass budgets, and the more budget you have, the more likely you are to do well at the Oscars, unfortunately, in general, because there is a lot of campaigning that goes into the Oscars, and there are multiple millions of dollars that companies can put into the marketing of a movie, specifically not just the marketing but to the campaigning to get that movie in front of the Academy voters. Because what happens is you're allowed to nominate movies. They essentially send voters a list of every single movie that is eligible, and then they get to vote for their nominations within the category that they are a part of, because you can only join one branch. So if you're like an actor, you join the acting branch, you can put your nominations in for best actor, actress, supporting, etc. But you wouldn't be able to vote for the nominations on like best sound mixing. But
an actress may not know anything about
that's the idea,
and vice versa.
That is the idea. Yeah. However, they can vote once the nominations are confirmed and announced. They can vote for any category. They are encouraged to only vote for the ones they know literally anything about. That might not happen. And I think that one of the categories that a lot of people point out that this maybe doesn't happen in is costume design. A lot of people in the costume industry have made a lot of complaints about the fact that there are like certain people, including the people who have won, they have said like, why do we keep winning? Our costumes are not the best, because it might be that they look like they should be the best, but if you know anything about costuming, you know that they aren't.
Hey, I've worn clothes before. I can be considered an expert.
But it's like, yeah, these look nice. So if your movie can pay enough money to get enough buzz to get it in front of people so they actually see it, they are way more likely, to vote for a movie they've seen and liked than one they've never actually seen or even heard of.
Or one that they've seen on a billboard as they're driving around Hollywood.
Exactly.
Which I'm citing the phenomenon of if you're around Los Angeles in award season, you will have for your consideration Lady Gaga for House of Gucci, for example, and they'll buy up those billboards just so that you're front of mind, and so that movie is front of mind when they inevitably get given the lists that they then have to vote on, and maybe haven't seen Lady Gaga do a weird Italian accent for about 3 hours.
And so, like, this all seems like, when you look at the inner workings, like a bit of a mess, to be honest. And yet it's still given a lot of prestige, and like we can't ignore how important it is and the reflection it has on the film industry, all the stuff we've talked about already in this video. At this point in our notes, Jazza, you wrote down, how is this changing? Or how has this changed? I then changed it to, is this changing? Because I am not convinced that it necessarily is. I think we have obviously seen, like you pointed out, the material differences that they're trying to make structurally.
Yeah, the criteria in order to be able to be nominated for certain awards.
Exactly, and who's going to make up the Academy. But these issues that get talked about through the history of queerness in the Oscars, actors feeling like they can't come out, straight actors being awarded for queer roles, like those things are still happening. Like Power of the Dog, for example, Benedict Cumberbatch, Benadryl Cucumber has been nominated. And he has commented on this, on the idea of like, should I be taking these roles that I have had now multiple Oscar nominations for, while ostensibly being like a straight man in a relationship with a woman with like kids with her. Interesting quotes from him. Interesting in that they are very ambiguous.
Okay, so I don't know what these quotes are, so I'm ready to be hit.
Okay,
and so have a real life live reaction. Let's go.
This is a live reaction from Jazza. So
Jazza reacts.
He has said, while my lived experience is very far from Phil's, his character in Power of the Dog, that's not to say that all of it is. He says carefully, being the Vanity Fair journalist inclusion. But that's where we get into the realm of my privacy. If your community is underrepresented, then that's why people will be rightfully angry. I understand it. I do understand it. Maybe I'm entering a new era where I have to be much more sensitive about it.
What?
Here's the thing. And this is his publicist. Great coaching of him on this answer, because he will have been coached on this answer. Because this will definitely have come up. Essentially, if Benedict Cumberbatch is a straight man, this is him being like, I'll think about it. However, if the implication is when he talks about this is going into the realm of my privacy, I am actually queer, I'm, I guess, bisexual, assuming that he isn't gay and
or pan or
with his wife as a beard. And therefore, like, it's almost kind of offensive that you've asked me this question because you're going into the realm of my privacy if you ask me to talk any more about this. But because he isn't confirming or denying anything, we kind of just have to give him the most generous benefit of the doubt. Because otherwise it's like, what are we going to do? Invade the man's privacy? Jazza, come on. A very smart answer from a PR point of view. Regardless of whether or not he is straight. It's a very good answer.
Yeah,
in terms of covering his bases.
But also, like, my reaction was, well, that says nothing.
Yeah, it doesn't. Of course it doesn't.
And hey, at least as a queer kid growing up, maybe less so now because I'm old and jaded.
I can see that cowboy masturbating in a clearing with a scarf around his neck and know that I've been seen by Benedict Cumberbatch. Hey, I've truly been known by the actor who is Benedict Cumberbatch.
Hey, Rowan, you joke, but Brokeback Mountain was a closet keep for me. But
but this isn't Brokeback Mountain, Jazza. This is Power of the Dog.
100%. But you mean there's two queer cowboy movies? I don't understand. Wild West.
Because I can see from this answer a scenario in which Benedict Cumberbatch is queer, bi, pan.
Yeah.
He's had experiences when he was younger, when he was being a lovey actor, whatever. Maybe he hasn't. Maybe he just felt those emotions. He's been told, when you get into Hollywood, do not say you're anything other than straight if you want those lead roles. We need you to be as appealing as possible. You're starting your career. Like, I know that he used to live with, there was like a bunch of actors who used to live together who are now like really well known. I think Tom Hardy and him used to live together maybe. And so I can see them all being told, especially because Tom Hardy is another actor who, before maybe he got attached to any kind of PR person, was way more open about the fact that he has definitely at least kissed some guys before. And so I can definitely see a scenario in which Benedict Cumberbatch or an actor similar to him who now has a wife and kids is like, well, I don't plan on divorcing this woman. I'm planning on being in the industry for a long time. Why would I say, oh, I'm actually bi if I don't have to? If it's going to damage my career and someone else who's actually open about it and could be in a relationship with a man and be a role model or whatever can do it for me. Like, that's like, it's nothing to do with me and it's my privacy and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I think this is an answer that gives that as a possibility, even as it also is potentially not a possibility. Like, it could also be not a possibility as well.
And I know that it's all very well for me to be like, but representation is very important for me personally. But there are some actors, right, who have come out in some way, shape or form and then have said that it's affected their careers, right?
Yeah. Rupert Everett, I think, is probably the most famous one in that he was kind of like, not necessarily the original person to say it, but the person who said it very loudly.
Yes.
And I kind of was looking back at, you know, is this thing of the past? Have people commented on it more recently? And they have, it turns out. So in 2012, the Equity did a big survey. And when we're talking about 2012, again, this is like at the height of the gay marriage debate, like all of these kind of the point at which queer people, well, specifically gay people, I guess, were getting like legalization across the US in various ways. And they found that only 57% of gay actors felt like they could be open about their sexuality to their agents. So not even like publicly, just to their agents. And over half of gay actors who responded to the survey said that they feared being offered only stereotypical roles if they came out, while being denied romantic leads in particular. And so this was something that was happening in 2012. So I was like, okay, we're getting more recent. It still seems to be a problem. In 2020, Matt Bomer also did an interview basically saying like coming out cost me opportunities. As like an actor who has been out for a long time, he was like, yeah, it cost me opportunities. It cannot be denied. Like it might have been, and a lot of these actors that talk openly about this talk about the fact that it's good for them personally, their mental health, their like relationship with people, etc., etc. But for their careers, it did have an impact. And then last year, Kate Winslet did an interview, which sounds very random for Kate Winslet to have done this interview until you remember that Ammonite came out.
Sure, okay.
Where she is playing a lesbian. But she essentially talked about the fact that, you know, she's been in Hollywood for a long time and she knows that there are a lot of queer actors still in the closet in Hollywood. She specifically was like, I know at least 4 who are deliberately hiding their sexuality. And then there is also has said there's a very well-known actor who has been told specifically not to publicize being bisexual, which, to be honest, could be Benedict Cumberbatch. We don't fucking know. But it could be anyone. And I don't think that speculating as a way of like trying to figure out stuff is very healthy. And I think that to have a straight actress as Kate Winslet is sort of portrayed herself to be, at least, because again, I feel like this is a caveat, but you understand by now, people listening, like we're calling people straight just because that's how they've labeled themselves at first. And like, you know, heteronormativity means we obviously like automatically assume everyone's straight and blah, blah, blah. For the purposes of this, I think it's useful to make a separation between people who have come out and people who haven't, because it's a lot about public perception, not necessarily about people's inner identities and their personal lives. And so for her to be able to say that, I think is like, it's not coming from an openly gay actor who might be seen as being bitter or exaggerating or like, oh, of course, you know, all the gay actors in kind of thing. It's just, she's just this random woman who's been in the industry for a while.
Kate Winslet, like, random woman.
That's how she's known in the industry. But she's like, I've been here for a while. There is no particular reason for me to be the one who knows the secrets of the gay community in Hollywood. Sure. But even I have heard of at least 4 people, including one who has been explicitly told not to, not just like, for personal reasons, but like has been told by their people, by their representatives. And that was last year. That was less than a year ago. So I think that it's very much like not over. And however much we're going to celebrate like wins for queer movies and queer storylines, it's not suddenly all sunshine and rainbows. And I'm hoping that the shifting towards kind of having these conversations, the shifting towards things like Moonlight kind of getting that win will mean that, as I said, like the timeline in Hollywood's quite long, so the effect of Moonlight will be a few years like afterwards in the making. So it feels like we're definitely coming up on when that should be happening. Obviously a little bit thrown off kilter by production schedules in 2020 and beyond.
Sure.
But I don't know what that looks like currently. Like I feel like we're still waiting for there to be a real sense of like trans filmmakers getting to make their own stories that aren't like the Wachowski sisters who already have this like huge profile in Hollywood, like up and coming talent, and also schemes that allow that up and coming talent to actually get the opportunities, right? Like it's all well and good saying, oh, if someone is good enough in their career to be nominated to get into the Academy, we should like allow those people to get into the Academy. But like people have to get to the point in their careers where they've been working long enough, where they have those nominations, etc., to get there. What are we doing about getting people in the industry? About allowing people, you know, if you're talking about actors, you're talking about people who oftentimes are going to have other people supporting them. Writers, similarly, because there are so few roles, because they're having to take like poorly paid jobs at first, or directors or producers who are having to use their own money. You're talking about people who already a lot of the time have capital of some kind, whether it's cultural capital, contacts, or money. And so it's trying to get people to a place where they're able to to do that. And also looking in other places for talent, right? Like, who are the people who are on TikTok who are able to afford a phone and that's it, who don't have any extra equipment, but who are using their skills and their creativity in an interesting way. And I have seen, like in publishing, for example, I know there are people at Penguin who are specifically looking at both people who are like writers on TikTok who are talking about their story ideas, but also people in general who are just interesting people who might have an expertise or a story to tell or advice to give, or like whatever it is for nonfiction books. Like, they're actively looking to find people in that area. And it feels like you want there to be people looking at YouTube, at TikTok, at these like smaller levels, at like youth groups that are running like pop-up film workshops to like, let's shoot a scene in however long. Like, these kind of initiatives feel like they're maybe even more important than who wins the Oscar, because they're going to be the kind of the real measurement of what is getting made at large and what is getting out to people, especially when so many films are now going to be direct to streaming. Like, it isn't just that there are very few big blockbusters that are going to be able to get themselves to wider audiences. Streaming has really allowed for those smaller films, smaller budget films to get their place. And I think that's maybe ultimately what's going to be more important.
You've talked really eloquently. I'm blowing smoke up your ass now. Yeah,
thanks.
No, you tuck that blue hair behind your ear.
I'll like slide over a crisp 10 pence.
Crisp 10p. Excellent, thank you. But you've talked really well in the past about how...
in the past.
Yeah, in the past, not now. About how... the deficit of kind of like queer representation in stuff like in the big blockbusters, like the big Marvel franchise movies and stuff like that. And I think that really is where there is a huge deficit in representation. You've spoken really well about how the representation of actors in kind of like the heights of Hollywood awards aren't being represented, but also the big mass consumption movies. It's still a big deficit. I mean, are we really going to stop at Love, Simon? It's kind of like that where it kind of like, is that our peak?
We did it once.
Yeah, we did it once. We don't need to do it again. And I think that really is. It's maybe, I hope it's not the final frontier, but it's the frontier that I really want to see kind of like chipped away at, and be more than just kind of like a throwaway character who isn't named and is maybe in a Disney movie maybe for 3 seconds, or is an unnamed character in a Marvel movie. Like, those are kind of like parts outside of the big industry of the Academy Awards that I would really like to see more effort.
And we kind of have some, like in Eternals, for example, we have a kind of queer couple characters.
Yeah, and that did really well.
It did extremely well, but it's very much like, here is an ensemble. Here is like one of many, and not and not one of the main focuses of the movie. And I think that we're gradually getting that. I mean, they've seemed to have committed to Young Avengers, which there's like a token straight in that group. People have pointed out that they've aged down the Young Avengers, hypothetically, like if we're... Not to make this a Marvel thing. Basically, Young Avengers are
going into video too.
Young Avengers are some kind of a group of young people, but they are within the comics like teenagers. Like, they have romantic relationships, but they've cast, for example, 2 of the characters within WandaVision as kids, right? Like, so it's very easily justifiable of Disney to not have their sexuality be explored as a very clever way of essentially representing this very gay group from the comics. Without that, I feel like they will absolutely alienate all of the original fans of the comics if they do that. Like, it will be so transparent, but by aging them down, which they have, that is in fact a possibility.
It also buys them time, I guess, for the industry around them to catch up. But it is those big studios that shape the industry.
Yes.
And until people take some more chances, I can't believe that it's even still kind of like seen as a chance. But yeah, I would really like some progress to be seen there. And I want the next iteration of Iceman to be gay, like in the comics.
There we go. That's the one demand.
Yes,
Bollywood,
that's
you're
all
listening.
I want.
Jazz at once.
Make Bobby gay.
Bobby gay.
Thanks.
Sweet. Is there anything else that we want to add, or is that the end?
Follow me on Twitter.
So that was just a discussion that me and Jazza had around the Queer Oscars. This was inspired by the fact that we have an episode that we're just actually about to record right now, sat in these same chairs, about Power of the Dog. We did an Oscar special for The Favourite back in the day, and that was really popular. Like, a lot of people, I think, were really interested in kind of going to prove a lot of the stuff we've talked about in this video. The excitement for Oscar nominated movies and people commenting on them and wanting to hear about them was very, very high. So we thought we would do it for this time around, especially because Power of the Dog is set to be such a front runner at these Oscars. So if you enjoyed this discussion, please go check out the podcast. Specifically, Power of the Dog will kind of tie in a lot to this video, but all of our videos about different movies in very different genres, not just the award-winning ones, but also we've got like an episode on teen trash movies, on other movies. What are the other genres we've done?
Queer Korea.
Horror. Comedy, Dear Birdcage.
Yeah. Others.
Okay.
I'm helping.
If you would like to help support the work I do on my channel, then I will also leave a link to my Patreon in the description, along with my social media links. You can find me all over the internet. And until I see you next time, bye. Boom, the end.